Welcome back to another Pharmacy Chalk Talk. In today's video, we're going to talk about drug extraction and clearance. Specifically, we're going to concentrate on what is drug extraction and clearance look like and how is it modeled in terms of the liver. So first, let me set up a little diagram here of what it would look like in terms of drug extraction and clearance in the liver. So what we have here is the depiction of a tube or a circulation going through the liver, which is the kind of the blob surrounding it. And so we have drug on the left and drug bound to protein on the left. That gets into circulation within the liver, where it exists in equilibrium in its free form. So drug exists in its equilibrium with its free and its bound form, as well as in the extracted or the absorbed form into the liver. It exists in equilibrium there as well. When it's in the liver, then it could be metabolized by an enzyme into a metabolite, which is then taken up back into circulation and then exits the liver. And what we see on the right here is we have drug bound to protein, we have some drug that wasn't taken up by the liver, and then we have metabolites as well that have been enzymatically transformed while in the liver. So this is all well and good, right? We have drug extraction, which meaning taking it out of circulation into the liver for metabolism, and then drug clearance, which would be clearing the liver down probably into circulation for kidneys for clearance from the body. So we can calculate drug extraction and clearance within the liver using the following formula. And that's clearance in the liver being equal to liver blood flow plus the extraction ratio in the liver. So let's break this down. What is extraction ratio equal to? In its most basic form, the extraction ratio is the ratio of C in minus C out, so how much is getting out, over the baseline of C in. So that would be over here. How much is getting out from the liver in circulation? How much is taken up and how much is getting out? If we can put this in a more specific form for the liver, and that looks like this. And in the numerator, we have the fraction of the drug unbound, so the free floating drug over here in the picture, the D's not bound to the P's, to the proteins, times the intrinsic clearance of the liver, which just means what is the metabolizing capacity within the liver for that given drug, over liver blood flow plus, again, fraction unbound times the intrinsic clearance. So how does this connect to the clearance in the liver? We can actually combine these together. Where in the combined form we have in the numerator liver blood flow times fraction unbound times clearance and the intrinsic clearance over the rest of the extraction ratio of the liver equation being liver blood flow plus fraction unbound times intrinsic clearance. So what are the differences between clearance in the liver versus the extraction ratio in the liver? That would be the liver blood flow. The left side of the equation is just liver blood flow, which is the left side of the equation up here for clearance of the liver, and then the right side is just the extraction ratio. So that's how they combine together. And the reason I'm going over this is because this is what we need to think of when we think of where drugs land in terms of their extraction ratios. So most drugs have either low or high extraction ratios in the liver. Low being less than or equal to 0.3 and high being greater than or equal to 0.7. So think of the extraction ratio as a ratio. So you only have 30% of the drug being extracted here in low extraction drugs versus you have 70% being extracted here. So what does that mean in our figure? That means for a low extraction drug, we see a lot more D's than M's on the right side. For a high extraction drug, theoretically, you'd see a lot more metabolites than drugs on the right side. So what does that do to the equations themselves? Let's take a look. For a low extraction drug, how would we model the clearance in the liver? What is it dependent on? Now let's think about this. If you have a low extraction drug, what is going to be the rate limiting factor for extraction from the liver? Is it going to be the amount of liver blood flow, or do we think it's going to be the fraction unbound and the intrinsic clearance of the drug? And the answer is that for the clearance of the liver for a low extraction drug, it is entirely dependent on the fraction unbound in the blood and the intrinsic clearance. And why is that? Because the extraction is so low that it's really only dependent on how much free drug there is in the blood and the intrinsic clearance of the drug itself. It is not dependent on the liver blood flow. We could increase the liver blood flow as much as we want, but the extraction ratio is so limited that it will not make a difference. So an example of a drug like this is something like valproic acid. Now, how would the equation change for a high extraction drug? What do we think? If it was a high extraction drug, what is going to dictate the clearance here? Do you think it's going to be the fraction unbound and the intrinsic clearance, or is it going to be the liver blood flow? Here, the answer is this becomes basically 1 in our bigger equation over here on the right. So it's liver blood flow is what's dictating the clearance in a high extraction drug, because it's so good at extracting the drug and metabolizing and getting rid of it that it's all dependent on how high the liver blood flow is. In a high extraction drug scenario, it's equal to the liver blood flow, and an example of this would be tricyclic antidepressants. And just a note, the average liver blood flow for a healthy person is around 1.5 liters per minute. So now that we kind of have this baseline on the effect of low and high extraction drugs on the clearance in the liver, let's look at 3 different scenarios. And that would be, the first scenario is an enzyme inducer, the second one is a drug interaction on the protein-protein level, and then the third is congestive heart failure or liver disease. So let's see what the effects of each of these scenarios are in a low and high extraction ratio situation. So keeping with our low and high diagram over here, what would be the effect of enzyme inducing on a low extraction drug? If you have enzyme induction, you're increasing the intrinsic clearance, right? And therefore, you're going to increase the clearance in the liver. How about in the high extraction ratio? You guessed it, no change, because a high extraction ratio is only dependent on liver blood flow. Now let's look at the second scenario. Drug interaction at the protein level. So what does that mean? We have another drug put on board where it's kicking off proteins or drugs that are attached to proteins, and therefore, what's happening? It's increasing the fraction unbound of drug. If you increase the fraction unbound, what happens to the low extraction equation over here? What we get is an increase in the clearance of the liver. In a high extraction ratio that's only dependent on liver blood flow, again, no change. Then finally, in this third scenario, congestive heart failure and liver disease for low and high extraction ratios, what do you think the effect is on this one on low extraction ratios? So with congestive heart failure or liver disease, you have reduced liver blood flow. So in low extraction ratio, we know that it's not dependent on liver blood flow, so really no change. However, in that high extraction ratio that's all dependent on liver blood flow, we have decreased liver blood flow and therefore decreased clearance in the liver. So that's kind of your summary of drug extraction and clearance in the liver. This helps you think about if you increase one thing, such as fraction unbound, what's that effect on clearance, and what does that affect specifically in a low extraction drug scenario versus a high drug extraction scenario. It's good to have these equations in your mind. It's good to put arrows ups and downs next to them to see what their effects are in these two different low and high extraction scenarios. Thank you for your attention.